The sound of a small sob cut through the stillness of the old farmhouse. It wasn't the cry of a child who had scraped his knee or lost a toy. It was deeper, broken, the kind of cry that carried loneliness and exhaustion far beyond his years. 8-year-old Daniel stood barefoot on the wooden floor, holding a broom too tall for his little hands. His cheeks were streaked with tears and dirt, his shirt clinging to him with sweat as his small shoulders trembled under the weight of tasks far too heavy for him. "Aunt Martha, please," he begged, his voice cracking as he dragged the broom across the floor that had already been cleaned twice that day. "I'm so tired. Can I rest? Just for a little?" But his aunt's voice came sharp, colder than the breeze that seeped through the cracks of the windows.
"Stop your whining, Daniel."
"Work builds character. Don't think you'll grow up lazy under my roof. Now finish sweeping, then wash the pots outside. No excuses." Her words echoed in the room, bouncing off walls that once knew laughter when Daniel's parents were alive. But they were gone now, taken too soon by a car accident that left Daniel orphaned at 6. Since then, his aunt had taken him in, though not with warmth or love, but with duty mixed with bitterness. To her, Daniel was not a child grieving his parents. He was another pair of hands to work, another mouth to feed. The little boy bent his head and swallowed his sobs, though they wouldn't stop spilling out. He pressed his lips together, fighting not to break down further. But the pain of loneliness cracked him open again. "Mama used to hug me when I cried," he whispered to himself, too softly for her to hear. What Daniel didn't know was that fate had quietly begun weaving something remarkable, and his tears would soon be seen by someone who could change his life forever. Miles away, a black Mercedes drove down the country road, its polished body catching glimmers of the afternoon sun. Inside sat James Whitmore, a self-made millionaire in his early 40s, whose sharp eyes often carried the weight of memories money couldn't erase. His life had been carved by loss and resilience. He knew what it meant to start with nothing. And on that day, for reasons he couldn't explain, he had taken a detour into the town he hadn't visited in years. As he slowed past the farmhouse, something pulled his attention. A sound carried faintly through the open window. A child's cry. It wasn't a tantrum, nor the playful squeals of youth. It was a cry of exhaustion, the kind he recognized from his own childhood, when life had demanded too much too soon. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. Something deep inside him urged him to stop. James parked and stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against gravel. He approached the porch quietly, the cries growing clearer with every step. Peering through the open doorway, he saw Daniel, frail, small, sweeping with trembling hands. His lips moved with silent pleas, begging for relief. Behind him stood Aunt Martha, arms crossed, her face hard as stone. The sight rooted James to the spot. He was no stranger to pain, but watching that boy, he felt his heart crack wide open. He remembered himself at that age, alone, overworked, praying for someone to notice his struggle. He had promised himself long ago that if he ever saw someone in that position again, he would never look away. "Martha." James's voice rang out firmly as he stepped inside. Startled, she turned, her face flushing. "James Whitmore," she stammered. Everyone in the town knew him, the orphan boy who grew up in poverty, who now owned companies across the state. His presence alone was enough to unsettle her. But James didn't waste time on pleasantries. His eyes were fixed on Daniel. He crouched down to meet the boy's teary gaze. "Hey, buddy. What's your name?" Daniel sniffled, clutching the broom as if letting go would bring punishment. "Daniel," he whispered. James gave a small, warm smile. "Daniel. That's a strong name. You look tired, son. How long have you been working?" Before the boy could answer, Martha interrupted, her tone defensive. "He's just learning responsibility. Kids these days are spoiled. I'm teaching him discipline." "Discipline." James's voice sharpened. He stood, his tall frame towering over her. "He's a child, Martha, not your servant. Look at him. He's exhausted, crying for mercy. That's not discipline, that's cruelty." The room went silent, save for Daniel's soft sniffling. James turned back to the boy and gently took the broom from his hands, setting it aside. His touch was steady, reassuring, the kind Daniel hadn't felt in so long. Something shifted in that moment. Daniel's eyes widened, as though he couldn't believe someone had finally stood up for him. He bit his lip, then whispered, "Please, don't leave me." The words broke James completely. He had walked into countless boardrooms, faced down ruthless businessmen, and conquered empires. Yet nothing had ever shaken him like those 4 small words. He knelt again, pulling the boy into his arms without hesitation. Daniel clung to him desperately, his small hands clutching James's shirt, soaking it with tears. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of another's grief pressed against his chest, and in that embrace, something inside both of them healed. Martha sputtered, trying to explain herself, but James silenced her with a look. "He deserves love, not labor. If you won't give it, I will." His voice was calm, yet resolute, carrying the quiet power of a man who had decided. What no one expected was what followed. James didn't just walk out of that farmhouse with Daniel. He fought to give him a home, and he did. Court papers, lawyers, hearings. James was relentless. Through it all, Daniel stayed close, his trust slowly mending under the man who refused to let go. The boy who once cried alone in a dusty room now laughed freely in wide, open gardens, chasing butterflies and running across lawns bigger than his dreams. He still remembered the broom, the tears, the begging. But he remembered, too, the moment a man walked through the door and saw him when no one else did. And James, the millionaire who had everything but a family, discovered that the greatest wealth he could ever hold was the small hand of a boy who needed him just as much as he had once needed someone. The weeks that followed brought a change Daniel never thought possible. Gone were the days of endless chores and cold commands. His mornings no longer began with the weight of a broom or the sting of harsh words, but with the warmth of sunlight spilling through a bedroom window that was finally his own. James had prepared a room in his estate just for him, painted in soft blues, with shelves stacked with books and toys Daniel had never dared to dream of owning. The first night there, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, running his hand over the soft blanket. James peeked in, smiling gently. "Is everything all right, buddy?" Daniel hesitated before whispering, "Is this really mine?" James walked in, kneeling down so his eyes met Daniel's. "Every bit of it, and no one can take it away from you. You're safe here." The boy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't born of exhaustion or despair. They were tears of relief. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the security of belonging. That night, he slept deeply, holding on to the promise that he was no longer alone. Days turned into months, and slowly, laughter returned to Daniel's voice. James would take him to the park, to the library, even on trips across the state. He encouraged Daniel to play, to learn, to dream again. Daniel's smile, once hidden beneath layers of sorrow, bloomed like spring after a long winter. But it wasn't just Daniel who changed. James, too, found himself renewed. For all his wealth, his houses, his cars, his business empires, he had carried an emptiness inside him, a loneliness he never spoke of. He had lived for years believing success was measured in numbers, in power, in achievements. Yet in Daniel's laughter, he found a joy that no fortune could ever buy. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Daniel leaned against James's arm and said softly, "I wish my mom and dad could see me now. But I think they sent you to me." James's throat tightened. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice steady yet thick with emotion. "And I think they sent you to me, too." In that moment, neither of them felt like they had lost everything anymore. They had found each other, an unexpected bond born from pain but built on love. The town, once skeptical, soon watched in awe as the millionaire and the orphan grew inseparable. Neighbors who had whispered about James's fortune now spoke of his heart, seeing how fiercely he protected and cherished the boy who once swept floors until his hands shook. Even Aunt Martha, once hardened and strict, softened when she saw what love had done. She visited one afternoon, watching Daniel run across the yard, his laughter echoing in the air. For the first time, guilt weighed on her, but James, in his quiet grace, offered no condemnation, only a simple truth. Children don't need perfection. They just need love. But years later, that love became the foundation of everything Daniel stood on. With James guiding him, he grew into a kind, strong, and ambitious young man. He didn't just inherit the wealth of a millionaire. He inherited wisdom, compassion, and the certainty that someone had once fought for him when he had no strength to fight for himself. And James, once the boy who longed for someone to care, found his second chance at family in the little boy who had cried in a farmhouse one afternoon. Together, they wrote a new story, one where loneliness gave way to belonging, where tears turned into laughter, and where a millionaire discovered that the greatest treasure of all was not gold or success, but the bond of an unexpected son who finally had a home.